Good morning to those of you in Australia. Good evening to those of you in the UK. And I know we have a few guests in North America. Encompass joined the Themis family earlier this year, and we're delighted to be able to partner with them in this, our first event together. The focus of Themis is to provide insight and intelligence for those in the world of financial crime, helping their members to identify and manage specific financial crime risks. Themis are focused at exposing the latest financial crime threats, criminal techniques and trends. And what makes them special is their focus on showcasing the impacts of financial crime on the global economy in general. That's the other reason why the story of one IMDb is such an important story that needs to be told. In February of this year, I attended a similar event that Themis put on in London in conjunction with Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. And I was very keen to be able to try to replicate this event for the Australasian market. And whilst we couldn't do it in person, we're delighted that we've been able to use technology to facilitate this event. The event itself has taken on even more relevance as Goldman Sachs have recently settled with the Department of Justice for a $3 billion fine, and I think Bradley will provide some more insight into that later in the discussion. So these matters are very real and they're very relevant. In fact, my business partner, Wayne Johnson, and I co-founded Encompass many years ago because we personally had been the victims of significant financial crime, which ended up costing us millions and millions of dollars. So these issues for us, for Wayne and I, are very personally, and we know the impact that they have on everyone's life. About 12 months ago, Wayne and I did an interview in London when we were asked by an interview the scale of the dark economy. That's monies that come from people smuggling, drug cartels, tax evasion, even arms trafficking. And the top line number that came out of the United Nations was between $4 and $5 trillion per annum. And of course, in the world we live in today, just how big is $4 or $5 trillion? Is it really that big of a number? And the interviewer went on to qualify that the $4 to $5 trillion is enough money to fund the NHS in the UK for 20 plus years. So the amounts of money that we're talking about here are significant, and these issues that we're touching on today are very real. And what the billion-dollar whale story illustrates, it illustrates that more than ever we need to support the work of regulators who, together with financial crime and compliance execs, help to keep controls and regulations in place so that the environment in which we all work and which we all operate is for the benefit of us all and for the benefit of society as a whole. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Dickon and Bradley, who are both in London. And thank you all for joining this event. It is a great event that I am sure everyone will enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you very much to all of those who've joined us from Australia, from Singapore, KL, to Europe and America as well. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today interviewing our esteemed guest, Bradley Hope. I can think of no one better placed to tell us about the 1MDB scandal, one of the most audacious financial heists of the century, with all of its intricacies, personalities, and repercussions. Bradley is the co-author of the best-selling book, $1 Billion Whale, which dissects the scandal and shines a spotlight on its main protagonist, the modern-day Gatsby, Joe Lowe, as well as a full cast of leading politicians, celebrities, businessmen and women, and well-known companies across all corners of the globe. If you haven't read it yet, This is the book they tried to ban, the book that unveils the most unbelievable, gut-wrenching fraud where Lowe and a small band of accomplices stole billions of dollars, pretty much in plain sight, and then laughed all the way to the banks and to the offshore tax havens. Bradley himself is an award-winning reporter who's worked for the Wall Street Journal for the last 4 years, covering finance and malfeasance from New York City and London. Before that, he spent 6 years as a correspondent in the Middle East, where he covered the Arab Spring uprisings from Cairo, Tripoli, Tunis, and Beirut. Bradley's job doesn't tick many calm and predictable boxes. He was detained by authorities in Bahrain, reported from the front lines of the Libyan civil war, and has been tear-gassed in raucous Egyptian protests. He's a Pulitzer finalist and Loeb winner, and has written 2 other books besides Billion Dollar Whale, The Last Days of the Pharaoh, a chronicle of the final days and hours of the presidency of Hosni Mubarak, and Blood and Oil, an investigation into the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Crown Prince. Bradley, it's a real privilege and honor to have you back here on this Themis broadcast in partnership with Encompass. So, Bradley, let's start in this way. So, Malaysian politics, Saudi princes, Western banks, Hollywood celebrities, lavish parties, expensive champagne, turning the Eiffel Tower pink. The 1MDB case is an intricate multi-jurisdictional fraud that dragged so many people, companies, and offenses into its vortex. How would you explain the 1MDB scandal to anyone in our audience who perhaps isn't so familiar with the story?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Essentially, well, on one hand, the 1MDB scandal for me is a guide to how the world really works. We've seen so many scandals in the last decade alone that reveal aspects of the world. There's Panama Papers, Paradise Papers. There's the recent Wirecard scandal. All of them are extremely revelatory, but 1MDB has something really special about it because it was so. I think it comes down to Jho Low himself being so brazen and so dedicated to making this fraud work that he, from the beginning to the end, he really shows. It's almost like a lesson plan for how the world works in terms of the offshore system, the banking system, how Hollywood works. How international politics works with China. So anyway, just to sum it up, it's essentially Jho Low is this young guy from Penang in Malaysia who never had a real job in his life. He was just kind of a financier from his 20s. He became close to the Prime Minister of Malaysia, persuaded him to take over this new sovereign wealth fund. The sovereign wealth fund was a non-conventional sovereign wealth fund. When you think of sovereign wealth funds, you think of the savings account of a country from their oil revenue or something. In this case, 1MDB was a sovereign wealth fund that relied entirely on borrowed money. Initially borrowed money from Malaysian banks and later borrowed money from international investors, pension funds, through big bond offerings arranged by Goldman Sachs. And so all of this money poured into this company, and Jho Low was running it from behind the scenes. All of his people were in certain positions. It was almost, not that difficult for them in some ways because it was so fully captured and controlled by Jho Low and with help from the Prime Minister of Malaysia. And through a series of arrangements with foreign partners, they just stole that money. The large part. So I think they raised about $13 billion and they probably stole in the range of $6 to $7 billion, so about half of it. And so over the course of about 5 years, especially, this money was just stolen in a almost unbelievable way. Like, for example, the first theft itself is just remarkable. They arranged this joint venture with a Saudi partner, and on the paperwork it said, okay, well, we're going to send $1 billion, but 300 million go to the actual joint venture, and 700 million go to this other account. And it turns out that account, it all kind of came out later, was completely run and owned by Jho Low, this other company called Good Star. And that was the kind of the start of these, gushers of money that they had stolen coming into his possession. And he went on this, I think what people know about 1MDB is the kind of extraordinary spending spree that Jho Low went on, at first kind of as in secret, and later as he tried to rebrand himself as a as the heir of a great fortune that isn't true, of course. Going around the world on private jets and hanging out with celebrities and throwing probably the craziest parties anyone has seen since, maybe ever, but maybe since at least Adnan Khashoggi, the great playboy of the 90s and 80s and 90s.
I think, and Bradley, that's one of the most interesting things for me is you talk about it being unbelievable. You talk about the kind of size and scale of his theft and the kind of brazen antics that Jho Low kind of displayed in spending that money. And I mean, perhaps now here we are in 2020, and with the benefit of hindsight, it would be easy to say, well, look, this just wouldn't happen. Someone in this whole chain of events has got to go, this guy's a joker or a fake or a fraud. How come it took someone more than 6 years to press the stop button and kind of shut this whole house of cards down?
Well, in retrospect, there were many efforts to get to the bottom of it. There was many people who were suspicious of Jho Low, whether in banks or in the Malaysian kind of law enforcement apparatus, but they were just continuously stymied at different points. And I think it speaks to, I mean, it kind of maybe would create a slightly cynical perspective in somebody that it's really, once you've stolen enough money, it's very hard to kind of clamp down on that. He had such enormous resources to include everyone in the scandal. So even in Malaysia alone, I think it will never know the full extent of the list, the long parade of people who received some kind of economic benefit from Jho Low's theft. And he was, I think this is actually the key to why he was able to last so long, is he was extremely generous with other people's money. So that goes from a top conspirator who was already a billionaire would have got, like in this case, Qadam al-Qubaisi, this UAE official, he received about $500 million. So that was his price. And then it goes all the way down to the bottom. The people that became his personal assistants and stuff, they all became millionaires. And when you go from being a wage earner to a millionaire, it's very hard to, I guess, swallow. I mean, I haven't been through the experience myself. It's very hard to swallow this idea that all the money you just got was illegitimate and you should probably give it back. And so I think he just made so many people co-conspirators, and not even with them knowing the full extent of what they're involved in, just giving them the money, them taking it, that it stopped this thing from falling apart as fast as it should have. But on the other hand, it did kind of explode into public view in an extraordinary way. It just took some time. It took about 5-6 years, like you said.
Yeah, but again, it's extraordinary because even amongst that list of co-conspirators, as you see, there's a lot of very respectable professional business people there as well. So there's a lot of accountants, lawyers, auditors, trust providers, etc. How come none of them kind of blew the whistle either? Why did they get sucked into this web of kind of lies and deceit?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this is not a story with a lot of heroes in terms of whistleblowers. There are a few people that stepped forward and took on a huge amount of risk. Like obviously the early days of the 1MDB scandal were possible to cover from the Wall Street Journal perspective because the people who were doing that internal Malaysian investigation, they were quashed by the Prime Minister, but they found a way to get the information out anyways, and that was really important. So there are people that did things like that. On the auditor front, it was definitely not pretty because 1MDB kept having problems. With an auditor would find a problem, and then 1MDB would just kind of quietly replace them, and there would be no sort of remarks about that. There would be no public remarks about it. But obviously, it's a pretty serious red flag when you go through 3 auditors, all of them from the Big Four. So there's only one left, I guess. Yeah, so I think, and there was an example as well in some of the Goldman stuff where a lawyer stepped forward and told Goldman, listen, there's something funny about this deal. It doesn't make sense that 1MDB, a so-called sovereign wealth fund, is asking for the proceeds of the bond offering to go into this tiny private wealth bank that's based in Switzerland. Doesn't make sense. Like they don't have institutional clients. And but in a way, that's probably why Goldman Sachs is in the position it's in now, having to pay back all this money because it sort of ignored the red flags.
Well, absolutely, because you would think, and we're all trained as kind of finance professionals, compliance professionals, that you have to, write these suspicious transaction reports when something goes wrong like this. And what were some of the problems with the auditors? Why were they kind of unhappy with the kind of setup in 1MDB then?
Well, the number one problem was that original theft, which it started off as 700 million, but it eventually grew to about 1.8 billion of the total stolen. And what happened was they were constantly at 1MDB under Joe Low's direction trying to account or trying to come up with a way to conceal the fact that money was missing. So first it became, it was a joint venture investment. Then it became a loan to the joint venture investment. Then later on it became these units in an offshore kind of like a mutual fund. And the auditors kept saying, well, look, you're saying that you have this asset, these units, can we go and look at the underlying investments? Can we read the paperwork? And there was always an excuse from 1MDB why that wasn't possible, or why this was so illiquid it couldn't be moved. And I think that was probably the number one problem they had. And each time one auditor raised questions about it, the next auditor found a way to kind of make an excuse for this. Essentially, it was a literal shell. Inside this thing was nothing. There was like a few. It would be like opening the treasure box and finding a few pennies inside. So.
Yeah, and I think that comes out really clearly in your book in terms of how easy it is for criminals to set up new companies in offshore financial centers, tax havens, etc. So I think that was a really key component of the whole scam. But also, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's actually one of the pieces of the puzzle that you, Bradley, first spotted. Perhaps not from the sandy beaches of the British Virgin Islands, but from your time as a reporter in Abu Dhabi. Am I right?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the bits, so the scandal kind of erupted, and it all kind of came out in really a fragmentary nature. So in the beginning, we had a sense of what was going on, but we didn't have proof. So in the early days, we had these different scandals that were all related to 1MDB. There was this kind of corrupt system where 1MDB was doing deals, and then the seller of an asset was kicking money back into a charity that was really just a thinly disguised political slush fund. That was actually the first scandal with 1MDB. It's kind of largely forgotten now because the bigger scandal, came next. Then the separate scandal was that there was all this money that had gone into the prime minister's account from this offshore company, and there was no way to connect. And then on the other hand, 1MDB itself was falling apart, and there was money missing from the company. And these three things all connected, but in ways we couldn't yet figure out. And we still hadn't really proven that 1MDB was missing money. 1MDB and the Prime Minister of Malaysia were maintaining the company's fine. There's just a cash flow issue. And so what happened was we just did a very simple examination of the financial statements of 1MDB and of IPIC, the Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth fund that was partnering with 1MDB, and just saw this mismatch. 1MDB said they sent money over, and IPIC didn't really register having received it. And then in the book, we detail this one interaction we had with somebody who was trying to defend 1MDB and say that we're wrong, there's nothing going on. And we pushed that person to give us some wire transfer documents to show the money had gone to IPIC, to a subsidiary of IPIC. And when we looked closer at the name of the recipient, it was exactly the same, except there was an additional LTD at the end, a limited. And there was no company like that in the structure of the sovereign wealth fund. So we basically figured out there was a kind of a lookalike company in the British Virgin Islands that was created to take the money. It wasn't part of the Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth fund.
So amazing. So basically, they tried to con, the whole circle just by kind of manipulating some invoices and creating fake companies in offshore companies. But they might have got away with it if you hadn't spotted that one little tiny detail on that kind of payment notice, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I tend to think that the 1MDB was would have collapsed without my help, but I think we did definitely move it forward at that time for sure.
Well, I think you're probably being very modest, Bradley. And let's turn our attention now to the main protagonist in the whole story. And I think one thing that shines through from the very first pages of your book is that Joe Low, the central character here, the mastermind, really understood the importance of networking. And so for him, it seemed to be all about who you know. And I think you point out that he made, really powerful friends at Harrow, Wharton, and he acquired a taste for socializing with some of the biggest names he could buy, from Hollywood celebrities to the super rich and politically connected. So we've got legends of the screen like Leonardo DiCaprio, Martin Scorsese, musicians such as Swiss Beats, Busta Rhymes, Nicole Scherzinger, and models and socialites, Miranda Kerr, Paris Hilton, etc. So just take a listen to this. And actually, this is particularly for our audience in Australia. So this is a short clip taken from an interview by the UK chat show host Jonathan Ross, talking about the spoils of Low's patronage with the famous actor and musician Jamie Foxx. And I think, Bradley, you refer to this in your book. The full interview is publicly available on YouTube. But just look at this. I mean, this is an international star. He of Ray, Dreamgirls, and Django Unchained fame, actually boasting on air about his friendship with Joe Lau.
You're a movie star, and I get the feeling you fully enjoy that kind of side of life. Would I be right in thinking that you appreciate the benefits?
The benefits, man. Getting in the clubs and, I mean,
let me ask you this.
Restaurants and
I think I know the answer
girls
to this, but let me ask you this. Where did you spend New Year's Eve?
Well, you know what? Oh, yeah. You're talking about like this past
This is the benefits of
the
being
benefits,
a superstar.
Yeah. I got a friend, he got some money. And he flew me, Leonardo DiCaprio, Jonah Hill, and some other cats, and we flew to Australia, right? And we did the countdown in Australia. G'day, mate. How are you, mate? Jamie, g'day, mate. So we did the countdown in Australia, then jumped back on a plane, and then did the countdown in Vegas. That's crazy.
So he had. That's how famous he is. He had 2 New Year's Eve.
Yeah,
that's how successful
crazy.
you are now.
So listen, I think we've actually done better in using modern technology in this Zoom call. We're in 2 different time zones at the same time. But really, for me, it's amazing. How did this one guy manage to lure all of these individuals in, and how was this kind of central to how he managed to pull off the whole 1MDB scheme?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said before, he never had a real job. Like, he didn't graduate from college and then go and work in a bank or an investment house. So he was always doing his own things, creating his own funds. And I think he has one special talent more so than anything else, which is if he spends time with someone, he can very quickly realize what motivates that person. So if he's with, I think celebrities are looking for different things. Different kinds of celebrities are looking for different things. Some of them got paid just direct cash payments to attend a party, like Paris Hilton or something like that. Paris Hilton got paid money just to kind of like hang out with Joe Low for a few days in France. Meanwhile, on the other end, people like Leonardo DiCaprio, he doesn't need Joe Low to be paying him directly, but what he needs is a lot more money. He needs film financing. And so Joe Low had a solution to that. He told him, I have hundreds of millions of dollars and I'll fund, Wolf of Wall Street completely. And that's just true throughout the thing. If he meets a billionaire, he knows that they have different problems. Even the people that we think of being the richest people in the world, sheikhs in Abu Dhabi or princes in the Gulf, they actually have some liquidity problems. They actually could use $500 million of actual cash, and it would make a difference for them. So I think he just always he's listening to the person. He's actually quite a down-to-earth person. He's able to really engage with people from the top to the bottom. He's not like an impolite or aloof person. And so I think he could just figure that out, and he would immediately try to use it to gain their trust and to gain their friendship.
So basically what you're saying is all these hangers-on, whether they were the kind of ultra rich or the celebrities, they fell for his kind of charm and more importantly his money, and that perhaps blinded them to the kind of criminal sources of these obscene displays of wealth. I think there's a really good quote that I like from your book as well. And as the old saying goes, it takes one to know one, because whilst all these kind of celebrities are being fooled by Joe Lau, here's what Jordan Belfort, the kind of real life crook and inspiration for the Wolf of Wall Street, had to say about his very first encounter with Joe Low. So he said, Leo got sucked in. Leo's an honest guy, but I met these guys and said, these guys are effing criminals. I was like, I don't need these effing people. I knew it. It was obvious. And I love the fact that there's Jordan Belfort, you know, the real life inspiration for the Wolf of Wall Street, calling this out straight away on day one. And yet it took 5-6 years for the rest of the world to kind of catch up with that, and realize that something was seriously wrong there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think also that, I mean, the fact is, so long as he was stealing new money, you know, the alarm bell started ringing when 1MDB, it turned out to be essentially bankrupt. You know, so sometimes I think we find out about financial crime when the institution itself starts having real problems. So for a long time, it was just borrowing more and more money, and it was able to use some of that money to kind of recycle and kick the can down the road. But when that's why I think, you know, that was actually the key moment for 1MDB, is when it was trying to do this last minute IPO to kind of kick the can down the road a bit further, but there was so much bad noise and feelings about the company that they couldn't pull it off, and then things just rapidly started to spiral out of control from there.
Yeah, exactly. But I think you also describe some pretty brazen techniques that he uses. I mean, what would you say is the kind of most brazen technique he used to try and hide these problems and stop them from coming to the fore as the kind of house of cards began to wobble, so to speak?
Yeah, I think the one that I find the most surreal is that, so 1MDB was in a true crisis. The IPO had failed. It was struggling to pay debts, and he, you know, they managed to, in a last minute effort, raise another $1 billion through a new loan to kind of help, you know, stabilize the company. And so Jolo took the money and he cycled it through this chain of offshore companies so that the new auditor could say that they were redeeming money from those units I told you about in the beginning. You know, he would just cycle it through and it would just go round and round in circles like 7 times. But even then, he didn't use the money to stabilize 1MDB. He stole that money again. So the company was already teetering on the precipice because of all the stolen money, and it raised $1 billion. Probably could have bought him some time, but instead he stole that money in two, and he used it to buy his $250 million yacht, which is like an ice class yacht. You know, it can go through the North Pole, and he eventually lived on that yacht for a long time during the kind of his one part of his fugitive days.
So even as the kind of real warning signs were beginning to happen, even as this was all beginning to scare people around the world, he actually had the confidence to go out and buy a super yacht and just say, it's not going to affect me. Nothing can really hit me like this.
Yeah.
Is that a kind of personality trait of his in terms of that kind of you know, almost sociopathic kind of behavior, really?
Yeah, I think there is something a bit sociopathic about him, or perhaps it's almost like he's missing the part of a person that makes you extremely anxious and stressed. So I've never met anybody who spent time with Jolo who said, yeah, he was so worried, he was so nervous. They always just said he was remarkably calm and cool about all this stuff. You know, just observing the DOJ announcements about himself, you know, or whatever it is. Nothing seemed to, it was quite unflappable as a person. So I think that was also pretty critical, considering it's such a complex, brazen fraud. You know, I think anybody else, it would be weighing on them at all times, you know.
Yeah. Now we've talked a bit about the kind of techniques he used. We've talked a bit about his spending. We talked a bit about his celebrity friends. There also seemed to be a real pattern for Jolo around kind of pandering to politicians and using their influence to further his position and kind of develop this fraud. So obviously, you know, he used the former Malaysian PM Najib Razak as his principal pawn, but there's a whole kind of series of connections that he's building with the Chinese government, with former kind of US President Barack Obama, with Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. And so how was he able to keep using these kind of senior politicians and world leaders as puppets or actors in this elaborate play?
Well, those obviously happened at different phases. Like, you know, obviously the Najib relationship was core to the whole fraud part of the scandal. And then towards the latter part of the fraud scandal, he found this Washington kind of campaign finance guy and started working with that guy and doing all these deals. He was making huge amounts of money without real commercial justification. And so he would always find some person who could be the person who could get him in with somebody else. So and the reason he was doing that in the US with Obama was he was trying to basically prove his worth to Najib as well, saying, listen, I'm going to get you to play golf with the president of the USA, and that's the kind of power I wield. So for him, there was an aspect of power. So then, but the other kind of relationships happened at different stages. So when the whole thing started falling apart and the FBI started investigating, he could no longer travel around the world. And he started to spend all of his time in China. And so then now he was in China and he was trying to find a way to make himself useful to the Chinese officials and government officials there. And what he said to them was, listen, I actually have great blackmail on Malaysia. Like the prime minister of Malaysia was my co-conspirator in the scandal. And if you help bail him out, he'll do just about anything. And so basically Jho Low played this role where he helped China do these massive Belt and Road Initiative deals in Malaysia. In exchange, there was money that was being siphoned out of those deals to help cover up the 1MDB scandal. And Najib himself essentially started to yield sovereignty to China, which to me is actually probably the biggest crime of all in this whole scandal. Working, giving up all kinds of strategic grounds to China. This is a strategic country, Malaysia, where it's located in the region, and it was closer cooperation about naval things and the use of ports, and they had just gotten started when it all came unraveled. And then the Trump part was the final stage, which is now Jho Low's in a lot of trouble and he wants to get out of trouble. So he hired all of Donald Trump's lawyers, all 5 of them. Like he just hired them all in one go. And I think he has a very cynical worldview, which is everyone's got a price and all I have to do is pay the right people. And thankfully, in the OMDB case, we've seen it's not quite true. His worldview isn't justified because every time he tries to do something, it sort of falls apart, blows up in his face. So, he tried to get all this money to Elliott Broidy, this big Republican fundraiser. Again, like tens of millions of dollars, really large amounts of money. And now Elliott Broidy's in a lot of trouble for that. And everybody else who's involved is in trouble for that. And so it didn't actually have any impact on his case. And Donald Trump didn't interfere with the Department of Justice despite these efforts. So it's just one of those stories where it keeps going, and that's actually what I find most fascinating about it. It's very rare in journalism you find a story that just keeps going, it never stops. And in this case, it keeps going and developing and moving in directions I would never have guessed. Like the whole China part, I found to be utterly fascinating and again revelatory about something, a whole new topic that's quite opaque.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that's so incredible about this is the original heist is kind of unbelievable, and you think someone's got to notice that this is wrong, but then it keeps getting bigger and more daring, and as you say, Joe seems to be trying to fix these problems with even bigger and bolder bets, so to speak, and using these kind of world leaders to do that. So let's pick up on that a little bit. So obviously you and Tom Wright published Billion Dollar Whale in 2018, and even then things were moving so quickly, so you had to release a revised and updated version in September 2019. But even since then a lot has happened, so why don't we pick up from there. Let's talk about the former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak first. So in July this year, he was found guilty of criminal breach of trust, money laundering, and abuse of power. And although he was sentenced to 12 years in jail, he remains free pending the outcome of the appeal. Can we expect any more twists and turns with Najib's particular trial? Do you know?
Well, they convicted him on the simplest part of the 1MDB scandal, and actually a relatively small part. It was the part that occurred within Malaysia itself, because it was the part that didn't require the whole offshore explanations, the mutual legal assistance from different countries around the world. So there's still an extraordinary amount of mysteries in the 1MDB case. They could still be kind of revealed. There could be just a lot of revelations on that front. And also his wife is separately, Rosma, the former First Lady, she's also facing charges. So there's still the possibility for some new revelations in the case. And also one of the most interesting things that happened in I think in the last year is a Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission released all these recordings. So for some reason, Najib had his phone tapped the entire time of the 1MDB scandal, especially towards the end. And so like some of these recordings are him. I mean, they're just extraordinary conversations, you know, with the you know, obviously the Prime Minister of Malaysia calling the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and sort of beckoning him, oh, you know, we need to work something out here. This is really embarrassing. Can you help me? And these are the kind of conversations you never would expect to hear. And and so there's a lot of things like that that are still kind of coming. But I think in general, we've kind of crossed into a phase where there's probably going to be less headline grabbing news, especially ever since Goldman Sachs was fined in the last couple of months. You know, there's a few other things like Tim Leissner, the Goldman partner, we're expecting him to be sentenced to prison time. And there's a whole lot of cleanup going on in the scandal, but not so many big assets or big cases anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So you know, just touching on the Goldman point, so they recently agreed to pay what a kind of 2.9 billion settlement to the Department of Justice in October this year, and I think their tally of penalties across international regulators across the US, UK, Hong Kong, Singapore is now what, close to $5 billion. What else can we expect from Goldman and from some of the leading banks that were involved in this case as well?
I think Goldman was the biggest kind of financial institution to be held accountable in this, and I don't expect there to be anything quite on that level. There are still a whole number of cases in Switzerland involving the banks. You know, they kind of find them in a civil manner, but there's still criminal investigations going on. There's still criminal cases in America that have not been resolved. Like, for example, Joe Low worked closely with this former member of the Fugees called Praz, he's going to face trial. Elliot Broidy still has some outstanding issues. And there's another Goldman executive is facing a trial in America as well. But I'm not sure if there's going to be any sort of multi-billion-dollar fines and things.
Yeah, I mean, this is really of the moment now, isn't it? I mean, it was only what five days ago that former president of Goldman, Gary Cohn, kind of said he would pay back 10 million of those into a kind of Goldman nominated charity, and I think they are trying to reclaw back some of these kind of senior management payouts and partner payouts. Is that right?
Yeah, I think of the money that Goldman's paying, about 60-something million is being clawed back from the high-ranking Goldman partners who received that portion of their bonuses from the 1MDB bond issuances. I mean, you know, it's actually such an extraordinary case because these bond issuances, you know, your typical kind of fee for a bond issuance might be about 1%, and the way that Goldman structured it was almost 10% of the overall value of the bonds. Very expensive debt, and there's just so many red flags. You know, I think in retrospect they're kicking themselves, thinking, how could we ever even think this is even an acceptable risk at all? You know, because essentially at one point they had just borrowed money. The Malaysian elections were about to come, and Najib personally went up to a Goldman executive and said, I think it was at Davos, and said, hey, we need to raise another multi-billion-dollar bond, and we need you to do it quickly and as quietly as possible. I mean, you can't get more sort of suspicious than that. So they're really, I think they've taken a huge hit.
So you point, yeah, I was just saying, you point to that kind of 10% fees, and that really was one of the big red flags that got the Wall Street Journal and the Sarawak report kind of really wondering what was going on here at 1MDB, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was actually the first Wall Street Journal story, was about, oh wow, Goldman Sachs is making a lot of money on bond offerings in Southeast Asia. And even then they had a funny feel to it. People were starting to kind of talk about it, and it put 1MDB on the map as a very strange institution that was going around doing things that were not very commercial. You know, like that's a very expensive way to raise money for a sovereign wealth fund, especially with a kind of government backing.
Yeah, yeah. So what's your take on these latest developments, Bradley? So do you think these sorts of financial penalties and kind of criminal cases are enough of a kind of deterrent for others? So can bankers, lawyers, auditors, real estate agents, high value dealers, or others expect a kind of high raft of tighter regulations following this case? Or are we at a watershed when organizations themselves will be driving a more proactive approach to managing their financial crime risk because they see this happening and they see the kind of real and human impacts that financial crime has? What are your views there?
Yeah, I think, you know, I would say in 1MDB, there's a couple of big banks like Goldman, some of the small Swiss banks, some of the Singapore bankers have been held to account. Obviously, there's these cases that we talked about. But in general, the auditors haven't really been hit very hard. The law firms have not been hit at all, despite some really outrageous activity. Like in particular, there was a Sherman and Sterling, the US law firm, essentially operated as the kind of chief money launderer of Jho Low. I'm not saying wittingly, but for a long time, because what they did was Jho Low was transferring all this money, hundreds of millions of dollars, into this special kind of account that's meant to sort of briefly hold some money before a client's buying like a building or something. Instead, they were paying out all his bills, nightclub bills, you know, luxury charters and things like that. And the result was anybody receiving the money just knew that they were receiving the money from Sherman and Sterling, this like white shoe, well-established law firm. And it's unclear what kind of due diligence Sherman and Sterling were doing, because we now know that all of that money was just brazenly stolen and put into a Seychelles company and then transferred there, you know? So I think we haven't seen sort of across the board holding of account, but on the other hand, some of those institutions that weren't fined, they have had a reputational blow. You know, if you Google some of those institutions now, it comes up, oh yeah, they had this major role in this scandal. So I think that is probably a pretty serious deterrent, because nobody wants to be associated with being the sort of chief money launderer of Jho Low for a period of time, even if it was unwittingly. So, correct. You know, I think with these cases, there's so many perpetrators, so many co-conspirators. It sometimes feels disheartening to see that some of them, even serious ones, didn't really get hit very hard. But I think it just comes down to law enforcement taking a kind of perspective that they can't go after every single criminal. What they're trying to do is create a deterrent effect and show this is something that has heavy penalties and you may face criminal liability, but that doesn't mean that they're actually going to do that with every single case, because it might be just too burdensome with such a complicated case. So, and obviously we see Jho Low himself is still at large. You know, it shows you that unfortunately in this day and age, despite all the technology, all of the cooperation, a major financial crime that crosses the globe is one of the most difficult things to police. There's still billions of dollars missing. Goldman Sachs is paying for money that's missing. That money is still missing. It's still in the possession of Jho Low and people like that. Huge amounts of money. And so I think it does show you, you know, we have this quote in the book in the very beginning in the epigraph that, you know, if you steal a little, they throw you in jail. If you steal a lot, they make you the king. And that's sort of, there's some truth to that, I think.
Yeah. So any idea where Jho is at the moment?
So he doesn't have a lot of freedom, obviously, because he can't travel to most countries that are members of Interpol. There's red notices for him. So and obviously what we talked about, this Belt and Road stuff, he's kind of in a kind of probably unwelcome embrace with China, because they probably loved him when he was behind the scenes negotiating these deals. Now they're kind of considering him just like this embarrassment, because every time anybody mentions Jho Low, they say believed to be hiding in China. And China keeps saying, oh, he's not here. But, you know, even Malaysia keeps saying, well, we know he is there. You know, we have very clear intelligence he's there. So I think he's just going to have to stay there for as long as he wants to stay free, unless there's some deal he can work out with somebody. But it's probably close to impossible that he could work out a deal with the US. He might be able to work out a deal with Malaysia if the government swings back another direction or something like that. But I think he'll have legal problems for the rest of his days. And he sort of hopes to be like a Mark Rich character, where he lives abroad and sort of eventually finds a way to get a pardon or something like that. But it seems unlikely to me.
Well, he's still claiming that he has done nothing wrong, actually. So there's a documentary released last month by Al Jazeera called Joe Low, Hunt for a Fugitive, and he's quoted as saying, "I don't believe there's any wrongdoing." And he actually goes on to suggest that he merely borrowed the billions from one MDB, which I thought was a wonderful excuse. I mean,
Yeah, no,
he a bit stronger than that.
He actually really truly believes that if you create a fake loan agreement between the person that's being robbed and then the person who's receiving the stolen money, that it's okay. But it's all just papers that were created to justify these flows. And there was like this, I mean, I think his cover up in that respect is just laughable, to be honest.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, fascinating, Bradley. Thank you so much. I think we've got a bit of time now for a couple of questions from the audience now. So I can see some questions coming in there. Let's start with this one. So so the first one, Bradley, did you ever feel that you were getting yourself into some trouble as the kind of investigator and journalist? Did you ever feel in danger as the evidence of the scandal was beginning to unfold?
Well, I think there were a few examples. For example, one time Tom was in Malaysia in the kind of early days of the scandal, and I got a phone call from somebody saying, "We know Tom's at this hotel, and we're thinking about arresting him." So there was some kind of hairy moments like that. In general, I think I was always very nervous about cybersecurity, and I remain. That's one of the main concerns I have as a journalist, is because very wealthy people can hire people with extraordinary tools for hacking. And if you're willing to spend money, you can find a way into someone's computer. There's somebody out there with a 0-day exploit that's just waiting for some person like Jolo to come along and charge them multi-million dollars to get into someone's computer. And then we later found out, because of this China-Malaysia dealings, there was a lot of documents that were memorializing these meetings between Chinese and Malaysian officials, and the Malaysian officials formally asked China to conduct physical and digital surveillance of the Wall Street Journal people working on this story, like including like tapping their homes and stuff and following them around. So I think there was always stuff going on like that, but in general, I didn't feel an extraordinary amount of physical threat myself.
But they did, I guess, and I guess that the kind of lawyers behind this did try and threaten not just the Wall Street Journal, but lots of other people around this case as well. And there were all sorts of attempts, I think you say, to kind of suppress the information from coming out to the fore, whether that be through the kind of Petro-Saudi leaks to some of the Malaysian government ministers that were asking questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, the legal fight was, I mean, that definitely caused the most stress, because it was just, again, it's one of those things where if you're willing to spend enough money, you can really cause trouble for someone. I mean, they were threatening, for example, to publish in the UK, they were threatening every single bookstore they could find. They were sending them each an individual tailored legal threat. If you carry this book and advertise it in your store, you yourself are vulnerable to a libel lawsuit, which is actually in direct contravention of the libel law. It says you may not sue booksellers and distributors. You have to sue the author or the publisher. But they were just sort of operating with this, like, well, if we send a little bookstore in the middle of nowhere a scary letter, they're going to actually freak out and not carry the book. And they were threatening Amazon. They were threatening and this was going on across the world. The airport bookstore in Hong Kong they're hand delivering legal threats every 6 hours close to publication. Little bookstores in Australia, actually, Australia was the first place where the book came out, actually. just due to a kind of a quirk of the distribution. And I was very glad to see that some of the Australian booksellers, they actually gave interviews where they said, yeah, I got this crazy legal threat. It probably means it's a really good book, so we're gonna like put it in the window. So I appreciated that, but it was a pretty stressful time for us.
Yeah, I bet. Well, listen, it's a fantastic story and a really important one to be told, because actually, it is very much the Malaysian people that are suffering from this. They're the ones that are now faced with the kind of hole in their public finances to recuperate from these losses. I've got a question here related to that. So, question coming from Henry: the complicity of senior figures in the Malaysian government is one of the key factors in this story. How far do you think the situation in Malaysia has actually changed? So you mentioned earlier there are new buffers such as the Anti-Corruption Commission, but there are still a number of issues of concern. So Riza Aziz still walking free, and the new government has recently dropped a series of worrying financial crime charges. So do you feel history is going to repeat itself, or have we learned lessons from the kind of terrible impacts of this crime?
I think no matter what, I would say prior to the 1MDB scandal, Malaysia had much stronger institutions like the Anti-Corruption Commission, the various entities that were investigating this were investigating it in a kind of proper, independent manner. And after they were quashed by Najib, I think those institutions have never recovered. And I think Malaysia will still have, just like any country though, corruption issues, but because the entrenched powers like UMNO are still playing a big role, I think there will never be a full holding to account of what happened, including in UMNO itself, because a lot of the money flowed into all these different individual campaigns and politicians' pockets for their, that whole money that went to Najib's personal account. He mostly doled that out as kind of a political slush fund. And I think there's always worrying signs in this case of going backwards. But I do think in general, Malaysian people really woke up to this scandal, really understand financial crime more so than many populations around the globe, because this was a riveting scandal, that they were watching play out in real time. So I don't think the Malaysian people will accept any kind of brazen corruption. So there may be some steps back, but probably overall it's going to be a step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talk about this as a scandal and as a case study, but I think in Malaysia there was a lot of anger. There was a lot of anger on the streets about what had happened, and a lot of demands for quite serious change taking place as well. So look, I think probably final question here from the audience. So one here kind of related again. So there are a lot of interlinked malpractices involved in this 1MDB story, from money laundering and embezzlement to bribery and corruption. Which revelation shocked you most as you investigated the story, and which do you think is the most pervasive and insidious in our global economy?
I think, well, for me, when we were investigating the scandal, I kept feeling a kind of conservatism about how bad this was going to be. So I kept thinking, well, it can't be any worse than what we've already found. It's unlikely that it's going to be even more. And I think for me, the overarching feeling I had was just kind of shock at it was much worse than I thought at every step of the way. And every time I think that I know its limits, I find out that the limits were much further than I expected. So I think for me, it's the way that I would even argue the 1MDB scandal is not even a particularly well thought out or planned or orchestrated fraud. And yet it was able to go on for so long, spread so far, utilize so many aspects of the global economy and the offshore world as well. This is not like a drug cartel that's been doing it for decades and they've got a whole system and rigor and discipline. This is a kind of, millennial guy who just ran amok in the global financial system and mostly kind of came out doing okay for himself. I mean, he's in China with all this money still, living free. So I think that's been the kind of big impact on me. And then also secondarily, I'd say is this Belt and Road aspect, just how the sheer size of these deals, what was at stake, how much money was being siphoned. I was, again, just, it blew my mind because I'd heard things about the Belt and Road Initiative, but I'd never seen something in such detail laid out in all the documents that it was, this, at least in this case in Malaysia, it was exactly what the international community feared was possible from these Belt and Road deals, a kind of state-sponsored corruption from the Chinese government against another government in order to weaken that country's governance, and also to, walk away with these huge, quite profitable infrastructure deals as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the most intriguing things about this whole scenario is what effectively started out as the kind of almost the whims and kind of desires of one individual has grown and impacted so many different countries and states and leading politicians, and ultimately, again, it's the people of Malaysia who are most impacted by this in terms of grand scale corruption. And so it's kind of morphed and grown, and I think we'll probably see more of it to come. This is obviously a kind of, it feels like a theme that you like to explore in your writing. So your latest book, Blood and Oil, was published a few months ago, and kind of also focuses on a kind of individual's pursuit of power and wealth in this kind of globalized economy. Is this something that you particularly feel personally that you want to explore and write about?
Well, I do feel like it's an aspect, like I like to do projects where I get to know how the world works a bit better than I did before. And I just felt there was something extraordinary with Mohammed bin Salman as well, that his rise to power also was so unexpected and so aided by the international financial elite and kind of the investment world. So I think there is definitely some parallels, and there's actually some quite profound overlaps too, because one of the characters of 1MDB, Turki bin Abdullah, plays a big role in Blood and Oil as well, trying to oppose his cousin's rise to power. So I kind of just, I feel like Jolo set me up, and I'm just sort of following the trails, and who knows where it'll lead me next.
Well, thank you, Bradley, and please do continue to follow those trails. These are really important stories to be told, and so what you're doing is both brave but also fantastic and really important for all of us in the kind of global financial community to understand the different machinations of power and politics and financial crime. So fascinating. Thank you. I think, unfortunately, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to wrap up the Q&A session. So I'd like to first thank our wonderful audience for some brilliant questions there. And from our perspective at Themis, it's so encouraging to see such interest in the 1MDB affair and financial crime, even if so late in the evening or early in the morning. And please do continue the conversation and keep the questions coming over on our Themis Senate, which you can access via the link on the slide, or you can get instructions from the handout tabs on the lower right of your screen, and we'll both be there answering questions if you need to. A huge thank you as well to our partners in Compass for helping us organize and broadcast this event in the Asia Pacific region. We've seen today how criminals can hide their illicit activities by creating pseudo-corporate entities, often in offshore jurisdictions shrouded in secrecy. And Encompass provides a valuable platform that can help members unwrap many of these corporate entities to uncover the ultimate beneficial owners of companies in question. And as we've spoken about before at Themis, I'm a great advocate for automation and innovation and the importance of using the right technology to mitigate these risks of money laundering and other financial crimes for entities that at face value seem totally compliant, but in reality can be anything but. Roger, I look forward to many more Themis and Compass collaborations, virtual for now, but hopefully face-to-face in Sydney, Singapore, and North America as soon as we're allowed to. So thank you to Roger and all of the team at Encompass. I also wanted to quickly thank Dow Jones for initially introducing us to Bradley and for their continued partnership and support, which we value enormously, as well as a bit of a shout out to the Wall Street Journal, specifically for supporting investigative journalists like Bradley and his co-author Tom Wright in their quest for truth. And as we've heard, it's such an important set of stories that need to be told. So please do carry on doing that. Last but certainly not least, Thank you very much, Bradley, for your time and an invaluable insight today. It's been an absolute privilege to interview you again and to hear firsthand your experiences investigating one of the most incredible stories of hubris and greed that the financial world has ever seen. To me, Billion Dollar Whale really highlights why financial crime is an issue that should concern us all. Behind the daredevil glitz and glamour of this incredible story, Malaysia and the Malaysian people now have to face the consequences. The next chapter in this sad story is actually about continued political turmoil and roads, schools, hospitals, houses, etc. that now won't get built because of the multi-billion-dollar hole that has to be filled. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for listening today, and we hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you.